So one of the things we've been seeing a lot over the last 5 years is a lot of political commentary from the likes of Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and Konstantin Kisin. Great work is coming out from these guys. But what do you think they're missing in this conversation about how to save the West and this idea that we should just go back to a particular moment not very far away where we kind of had things right?
I think that the biggest blind spot that they have is that they still think that the West is something like the Enlightenment. The Reformation and the Enlightenment are the decline and the breakdown and the end of Christendom. And Christendom is the thing that makes the West uniquely what it is. The Enlightenment said, we're not going to believe in anything at all, religion, history, tradition, etc., except reason and science. Descartes is not just like doing geometry for fun. He says that the goal of science is for man to become the lords and possessors of nature. I mean, note carefully what the serpent says to Eve. He tells her, you shall be as gods. And then when reason and science got discredited, there was nothing to believe in after that at all. So people just stopped believing in things. And so this is actually what led to postmodernism and the breakdown of the belief in science and truth, is that science promised utopia, and then what it actually was used for was mass murder. You know, at the beginning of World War I, we were on horseback with sabers, and by the end of World War I, we had built tanks for the first time in human history, and mustard gas, and by the end of World War II, we were nuking each other. I mean, those technologies did not develop in isolation. They were driven by the needs of the secular states to destroy each other. What's left when you don't believe in truth? Because that's the postmodernist claim. What's left is power and pleasure. So you use power to get pleasure. And so a world of violence and self-indulgence is sort of the inevitable world that you get when you stop believing in truth of any kind. Now, what comes after that? I mean, something has to come after this. And what I'm noticing personally is what I call the dark logos, this kind of techno-paganism, where people are starting to worship ChatGPT. People are starting to take DMT and think that they're talking to these particular spirits who know how to govern the world. People are ready for aliens to show up and tell us, oh, this is the correct way to live. This will solve all your problems. So there's this hole here for something to worship, and we will worship. This is our inevitable destiny. We must worship something, and the bad path is that we worship a demon disguised as AI, or a demon disguised as the aliens who are superior, or something like that.
All right, well, Dr. Zac, it's an absolute honor to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I've become a massive fan of your work in a super short period of time. I was just stumbling across your work by happenstance on Substack, and I just couldn't believe that I hadn't come across your work sooner. I don't know why I haven't seen you doing speaking tours with people like Jordan Peterson, or speaking at the ARC conference, or going on Trigonometry or Joe Rogan, because I think the caliber of the things you're talking about, the way you communicate them and the way you make them so relatable and easy to understand, I think is of such value right now. Not only personal, people watching individually, but societally, civilizationally, dare I say, at this current moment, to make sense of everything, because we are living in this kind of topsy-turvy world. And so, before we get into everything, I want to encourage everyone watching that after they finish watching this episode, to please go over and find your Substack and YouTube and subscribe, because it is criminally undersubscribed. And I'd personally love to see you just kind of explode onto the scene a bit more, and maybe do debates with someone like Jordan Peterson and other people who I just think you could really add a lot to this conversation. So I feel privileged that I'm able to introduce you to some new people at least. So welcome on the show, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Now, before we do get into it, I'd love to have you give us a bit of an introduction into your background, who you are, the kind of work you do, and the kind of main questions that are driving your work at the moment.
So I did most of my academic work in philosophy originally, and I did so because as a teenager I was gripped by these existential questions about just everything, that was confusing about our society. I actually read Descartes when I was 14, and this really screwed me up.
Okay.
And then one day you wake up and you're majoring in philosophy. And after a lot of work in that area, I realized sort of the failings of modern philosophy and academia. And by the time I had hit my PhD, which I did at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., I had switched to theology. So I studied church history. And during that time, at the end of undergraduate, my wife and I and a huge group of my friends we all converted to Eastern Orthodoxy together. And that was a beautiful thing that freaked all of our parents out, but they came around. And I taught at Catholic University of America as a teaching fellow, and I taught also at a private school on the East Coast, Trinity at Meadowview. And then I taught here on the West Coast at the University of St. Catherine until the University of St. Catherine closed a couple years ago. And in my time teaching mostly philosophy and history and theology, what I found was that, you get these incoming freshmen and they have to take the required theology course. And you can rattle off all the what. The Eucharist is Christ, God is one essence in three persons. You can say all what we believe, but you just get these blank looks because the kids are thinking, okay, sure, but why do I care? What does that even mean? And more than what does that mean technically, what does that mean for me? And so what I found was that what they were really missing, and the thing that nobody really was talking about, was what I call the imaginative framework. I talk about that a lot on my show. So everybody, if you're in philosophy, you could call this hermeneutics, you could call it epistemology, big highbrow philosopher call it epistemic framework, but we're just talking about your imaginative framework, meaning how do you imagine the world to be? What are the categories in which you look at reality? And so I ended up writing all of these kind of pre-catechetical texts. Before we can even talk about, here's what's Christianity, we have to talk about, well, what is religion? What do we even mean by that? And so what I found was that all these fundamental questions needed to be redefined. And so I wrote a series of articles that I ended up teaching every year to my introductory to theology students. And then they turned into this book, which Ancient Faith published like 2 years ago now. And it's very short, and people have called it a catechism, but really it's a pre-catechism. We don't have an official catechism in the Orthodox Church, but it's a pre-catechism. And the idea is that your imagination, the way you think about the world, needs to be baptized before you can even begin to approach the doctrinal statements of the church. Otherwise, they're just very abstract. They make no sense. It's not clear how they even relate to your life. So that's kind of been the work that I've been doing. And then Ancient Faith approached me and said, well, would you like to do a podcast? And so I ended up doing this podcast, The Roots of Everything. It's going really well, and people are enjoying it. And what we do is we get to the roots of everything. We dig down and we say, okay, whatever this topic is, where did it come from? Why is it you believe what you believe? Why do you think in these ways? There's roots, philosophical roots, idea roots, religious roots at the bottom of all the conversations that we have as Westerners. And I think that just a very simple, basic historical overview of these things, even just the what happened at all, most people don't know. And when you know them, you realize, like, it kind of shuts down a lot of these abstract arguments on the internet. People get in these abstracted arguments about, oh, well, this is sola scriptura and this is solo scriptura. And you can kind of go down this rabbit hole of infinite arguing. But then if you just, to me, that's all very tedious because it doesn't really go anywhere. But if you just lay out, okay, well, what was the history of ideas? What informed the Reformation? Where did it come from? What did it lead to? And then you have a much better picture, not only of what we're actually talking about, but how then did all that stuff affect my life today? Me as a 17-year-old sitting in a classroom, or whatever. Why does this matter to me at any capacity? So that's really what I do. That's the work that I do, is that I try to bring to the surface these core formative ideas and make people aware of how their imaginative framework, the language they use, the categories that they think in, has been informed by these things. Because people think that they are free thinkers, and I don't know what that means, because you're part of a history, you're part of a tradition. Even if you think you're not part of a tradition, you just are. That's part of what it means to be human. So that kind of summarizes the work that I've been doing for the last 5 to 7 years.
All right, awesome. Well, my first question to really kick things off, which kind of relate to a lot of the kind of things that you've been saying, is that today's world really is this kind of clown world at the moment. People are identifying as dogs and cats and unicorns and fairies, at the click of a fingers. We are celebrating public executions of people we disagree with. We are obsessing over race and gender and pronouns in ways that make no sense. People are calling themselves pro-science, but then in the next breath they're saying that a man can give birth and become pregnant. So there's a lot of this stuff going on, and one of them is also saying that, well, morality is subjective, but then they get really upset when you don't agree with their version of morality, or they say that truth is subjective, and then everyone has to try and affirm their truth, otherwise, again, it's offensive. So we have entered a world where nothing makes sense. And I was wondering how on earth we did get here as a civilization. Has this all been the inevitable fruits of seeds that were planted centuries ago? And could you take us on a journey through time, through this evolution of civilization from pagan to Christian to eventually secular, that has gotten us to this unprecedented moment in our history?
This is always the part where I say, how long do you have?
As long as you want.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you want to, and this is still going to be kind of, I mean, obviously everything has to be a bird's eye view because we're going to do, like 3,000 years kind of in an overview, but I still think that those sorts of treatments are helpful for getting the broad brushstrokes because a lot of people you have no category to put any of this in anyway. So I'll start with this. I'll start with the standard academic narrative, and then I will twist it a little bit at the end. So if anybody's waiting to actually me, then just wait till the end. So the way that scholars have traditionally talked about the history of the Western world is to divide it into three classical kind of eras: the ancient world, the medieval world, and the modern world. And the ancient world is somewhere, prior to the birth of Christ. You could sort of draw the line traditionally at 500 AD. So everything before 500 AD is the old ancient world. And then 500 AD to about 1500, people say, okay, that's the Middle Ages, the medieval period. And then 1500 till now, that's the modern era. And this way of talking about things served academia well for a while. It has certain biases in it. But the most important way to talk about it for our purposes that answer your question is to talk about it in terms of the worldview that was dominant for each of those periods. So for the ancient world, the worldview that was dominant was paganism. And paganism is the idea that the universe is ruled by powerful spirits and that you need to propitiate them in some way so that mankind and these deities can live in a harmonious way, and that the universe can be part of this sort of ordered whole. Everyone has their stations in life, and we have to treat the gods the right way, and then they'll treat us the right way. This is also basically the paradigm of the religion of ancient Israel. It's all kind of the same thing. So when I say pagan, I mean the ancient Israelites were doing that too, that same kind of paradigm. Obviously, they had some objections to the pagan gods, but fundamentally, that was the sort of cosmic vision of reality for the ancient world. Now, all of this changes with Christianity. So some scholars have called Christianity the only real, true, sustained revolution in human history, because Christianity entered into the pagan antiquity, and it completely exploded and revolutionized all of their categories. It took the truth that was in pagan religion and fixed it, for lack of a better word, raised it up to a sort of a higher level. So Christianity didn't just come in and deny all the pagan religions. It took them and it took all the truth in them and then reoriented them so that they were properly oriented toward the truth. And it also introduced ideas that basically no pagan could have ever thought of. Like when St. Paul says that there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ Jesus. I mean, to me, that's one of the most radical things that had ever been said in human history up to that point, because there's really no reason, if you are a pagan, to think something like that. People don't appreciate how ridiculously brutal the Bronze Age was. And, I'm nostalgic about the Roman Empire as much as anybody, but I mean, they crucified people like nobody's business. I mean, they had no problem enslaving entire races or exterminating entire races, because for them, it was very obvious that some races are slave races and all they're good for is manual labor and slavery. And some races should just be exterminated. Other races are master races. Obviously, the Romans thought of themselves as a master race. And so it's like they lost zero sleep over torturing people for fun, exterminating undesirables, etc. people in the ancient world, by and large, lost zero sleep over this kind of thing. Because the concept of radical human dignity that we all take for granted today, not only did it not exist at that time, I would argue that it could not have existed at that time. There really was no reason to think that. And this may be surprising for modern people, because to us, it's so basic. We have this idea of human rights, everyone matters. But, a Roman would have just laughed at that. Why? Why on earth would that matter at all? This person is weak and useless. That's the facts. Now, of course, what changes, and the Christian response to that is, well, everyone has radical, equal human dignity in Christ, in our identity in Christ, because he took on our human nature. That's completely radical as well. Many Greeks and Romans believed in what you might call monotheism. Maybe they believed in the rest of the pantheon, but they all kind of realized that there had to be some supreme power that directed everything, that was the source of everything. Aristotle calls it the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause. They all understand that something called God exists and is the source of everything. They have no problem with that. What they had a problem with was how on earth could that thing actually take on human nature? And if you talk to atheists, they'll say, oh, yeah, there are plenty of stories about gods who, had sex with humans, and then their children are demigods, and blah, blah, blah. They can take on human form. Sure, that's true. But that's a very different thing. Christianity was not claiming that that's what happened. Christianity was claiming that the God, the unapproachable source of all things, the uncaused cause of all reality, itself took on human nature and joined our human nature to it. And that's a quite baffling thing that took several councils to actually work out how that could even be possible. So anyway, what's the point of all these things? Is that the stuff like the incarnation, that's one, and then of course Pascha, the Easter, are mind warping for the human race at this point. God radically took on our nature, and so we share in his dignity. And then he defeated death. I mean, those two things were the greatest revolution in thought, philosophy, religion that had ever come about before in human history. A lot of atheists talk about how Christianity is not unique or something. They try to downplay Christianity is special. As no other religion has made these kinds of claims before or since. And I mean, there are a lot of parasitic religions on Christianity that try to, okay, well, actually the real gospel is this, but they all are post-Christian. Anyway, so those two things radically transform what we would call the West and Europe. And so then you have this new age, a new age that you could call Christendom, that's informed by these values. And societal level changes start to happen. Slavery starts to weaken, actually, and eventually goes away in many parts of the world. The way that warfare is conducted changes. There's very good arguments that technological progress was actually one of the results of Christendom, of Christianity's ideas taking root at the heart of culture. And so you get this age that is totally different from paganism in terms of its values. And at the center of it is this value of the human person. That's why we depict all the saints. So the human person under the Greco-Roman world, if you remember, used to basically be the slave of the gods. Anytime, and you remember all your Greek mythology, anytime a human gets too big for his britches, the gods take him right down because he needs to know his place. But in Christianity, there's this radical dignity. We're being called to be real sons, to be joined to the nature of the Holy Trinity. I mean, this is totally crazy. And so there is this dignity that starts to unfold in all of Western civilization, in the laws, in the way society is structured, in just all of it, too much to say. And that creates a very particular kind of culture. Now, little footnote, because I don't want to misdirect people. I'm not being nostalgic about that time. I think a lot of people who are dissatisfied with today think, oh, well, we just need to go back to this golden age. It wasn't a golden age. There was sin and death, welcome to earth. There was always corruption. There's always problems. There's no utopian age. That itself is a secular idea, which we'll come back to. And so I'm not saying everything was perfect then. I'm just saying that society, by and large, was correctly oriented. And that's different than a society having no problems. You can have a marriage where you fight, but you're still correctly oriented in the marriage versus a marriage that just doesn't work at all, right? I think that difference makes sense to people. So that was that era. Now, Christendom starts to weaken. There's a lot of things that happen. I'm skipping over basically 1,000 years. And then what transitions Christendom from Christendom to modernity? So we got pagan antiquity transitions to Christian Christendom, or the Middle Ages, whatever you want to call it. We understand the transition. A man rose from the dead. That changed all of society. Okay, that makes sense. Well, what changed Christendom to this modern secular thing? How did that start? And there's a couple answers that you could give for that. The historic answer, I think, is actually the Reformation. So I think a lot of people identify figures like Descartes or Kant or the Enlightenment scholars, scientific revolution, Newton, and they think that, well, new inventions and new ways of thinking made belief in God obsolete. So this is kind of a God of the gaps sort of thing. This is sort of standard atheist criticism. It's pretty ahistorical, I think, because it's not like people were dumb and then they just woke up one day and realized you could do experiments and then I guess we don't need religion anymore. That's really a two-dimensional narrative when you think about it. And it skips over something that's very important in the West, which is how was this, you could put it this way, this question. How did this civilization transforming religion, Christianity, suddenly just collapse and die overnight when people realized they could measure gravity? That's not a satisfying explanation for how this thing that completely transformed pagan civilizations for the last 1,000 years is just like, oh, we decided we could use our brains, so now we don't need the church anymore. That can't be the whole story. Well, what happened is the Reformation happened. And what happened with the Reformation is, I'm gonna be criminally overgeneralizing, but if people want to know more, we did a whole series on this on my podcast. The Reformation is basically the discovery that you can make your own religion at some level. I mean, it's many different things, obviously. Yeah. But, when Luther insists on the primacy of the conscience, he can't violate his conscience. And when he insists that it's his reading of the text, him in the text by himself, you're essentially creating the foundation for a religion that is subjective. And so this is another thing people don't really realize is they think, okay, there was this Reformation, it corrected Catholicism, which had gone hopelessly astray, and then gradually over time it resulted in the different denominations we have today. And the fact of history is that there was literally no point during the Reformation in which post-Catholic Christians agreed about anything. I mean, probably everything would be correct, but very, very little. There was no point. I mean, immediately Luther was at the throats of all these other guys. Debates with Calvin, it was a complete disaster. And what it led to was the so-called wars of religion. And this is also a very misunderstood and much maligned kind of period of history, especially from the sort of secular humanist critics. And what they'll say is, okay, you see, religion was so divisive. It led to all these horrible wars. It was awful. You see, this is what's wrong with religion. Religion is violent. Well, that's not the whole story. The whole story is that what really happened during this period is it wasn't really the wars of religion. It was the wars of the emerging nation states. And what does that mean? So the secular nation state is a new form of government that's unique to modernity, meaning it's a type of state that has totally disconnected itself from any other religious apparatus, and the state just kind of runs on its own, or it's supreme over the church or something like that. And this didn't really exist in pagan antiquity. I don't think that you could have made the pagans understood what you were talking about if you tried to explain separation of church and state to a Roman emperor. I don't think he could have understood what you were saying, because for them, that would make no sense. The question, how should we run society, can't really be separated from the question, what is true about the universe?
Right. Yeah.
What is morally true about the universe? I mean, like, how do you disconnect those questions? Well, we did it. So congratulations. So what happened was, again, overgeneralizing, is that these emerging secular states, these princedoms and these kingdoms, really wanted to carve out their own national identity independent of something like the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church in the West, Byzantium's kind of another story, but focusing on the Western history that a lot of us know, the Catholic Church is a transnational authority. It transcends nationalities. It transcends state allegiances. It's your religion. It's the shared heart and soul of religious life of these people. And so you really can't have a supremacy for Britain or Germany or France or whatever if you have this kind of authority in place. And so my reading of this period, and I'm not the only one, is that the Reformation basically makes all these rulers realize that they don't have to listen to the Pope if they are not part of the Pope's religion, if they have their own religion. And Henry VIII, it's almost comical how cut and dry the Henry VIII example is, because he says, I want a divorce. Everybody knows this story. And the Pope says, you can't have a divorce. That's not Catholic. And he goes, great, I'll start my own religion. Like, it's almost a meme level of simplicity, but I'm oversimplifying, but I don't think it's, I mean, that's essentially what happens. And so what does he do when he founds his own church? He makes the sovereign, the head of the church is the King of England. So now we don't have a church state synergy. That's what it was called in the ancient world. Now we have something that's sort of formally the church, but it's really an extension of the state. This happens all over. And like France is nominally Catholic at this time, but then the crown basically takes over the appointment of bishops. So now the crown rules the Catholic Church in France. And is France really Catholic at that point? Not really. And you know this because during the 30 Years' War, the Wars of Religion, France sides with the Protestants against the other Catholics because it's politically advantageous for them. So all kinds of religious persecution happens during this period. And the 30 Years' War at this time, I believe, is the bloodiest, most violent war in European history up to this point. I mean, it's like the world war of the time. Europe is bathed in blood. I think half the population of Germany died. I mean, look up some of the stats on this. It's crazy. And nothing's resolved at the end of it. Right. They just realize, like, I guess we're not getting anywhere. And the reason they're not getting anywhere is that they're not really fighting about religion. That's the propagandist stereotype. It's the nation states, the secular nation states, using religious persecution as a tool to enforce their own national identities and to try to defeat each other, to see who's going to be the ruler of Europe. So at the end of the 30 Years' War, they kind of come up with this truce, which is like, well, in your land, there's a pithy phrase for it in Latin, but it's like, in your land, you get to have your religion. So it's like every country gets to have his own religion, and we're just going to leave it at that, and nobody bother each other about it. And so this basically leads to secularism from a political, governmental standpoint, because now religion is no longer allowed to be part of the conversation, how should we run society? Even though it continues to be, like, obviously religion and religious practices of the people continue to sort of inform their temperament and their aesthetics and their reactions to things. So Europe remains like Christian in that sense, spiritually. And we all know the famous story of, in World War I on Christmas Day, It was just understood that there was going to be no fighting. Just everybody knew that. It's Christmas. And if you've read All Quiet on the Western Front or anything like that, like that's like the last vestige of Christian culture in Europe. So that part still exists. It's not like everybody became, secular, robo-theist, atheist immediately. But at the level of society, Christianity, in a really authentic way, could no longer be a unifying force in Europe, couldn't really be part of the shared culture, and certainly was not allowed to have a voice in what happened in government. So, I'm sure many people know the famous example. There was an emperor who in the Roman Empire early on who there was this massacre, and Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, Augustine's godfather, I believe, at least his mentor, spiritual father, excommunicated the emperor. And 3 days later, he came back in sackcloth and ashes and repented. And then the bishop restored the emperor to communion, and it was a huge deal. Nothing like that had ever happened before. So I'm bringing this up as a counterexample because the church, in the person of St. Ambrose, was able to hold the state morally accountable for an atrocity that was committed. Now, that's very convenient if you're a secular ruler. You want to do what you want to do. And so this is very troublesome. So that kind of thing can't happen anymore. I think Joe Biden was denied communion a few years ago because he supports abortion, but one priest, and it was this little blip in the news about it. Nobody cares. That doesn't mean anything to us. Just like his Catholicism doesn't really, what does that mean if he's not accountable to a bishop? So then you get this weird situation where there is no shared religion in Europe. Religion becomes reduced to this matter of personal opinion. And you're allowed to have your personal opinion. That's very, very important to people at this time, that you have the right to your own personal opinion about religion. But we're not going to build a shared culture around it because we're all cynical and jaded about the fact that we just spent the last 30 years drenching Europe in blood over religion. So now Act 2 opens on the Enlightenment. That's the context in which you have to appreciate what's going on in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment shows up and they're like, you know what? We're going to do all these things. We're going to have a new method. We're going to the scientific method, and that's going to solve all problems. We're going to learn all truth about everything. We're going to apply it to the human person. We're going to apply it to government. We're going to apply it to science. We're going to apply it to math. We're going to apply it to education. And why are they so triumphalist about this method? It's like, if you think about it for a second, the scientific method that you were taught in grade school, hypothesis, go test it, change your hypothesis. It's like, is that revolutionary? Not really. I feel like people do this every single day about everything, and people have been doing this for all of human history. It's called have eyes, go look at something. I mean, this is not, when you really think about it like that, were people just so dumb that they didn't think to test their hypotheses in the ancient world? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. Right. So why is it championed in this kind of a way? Because it's ideological. Because what's the project of the Enlightenment? The project of the Enlightenment is to build a new worldview for Europe. And that worldview, because they're all post-Christians, and they're all nominally Christians too, or maybe piously Christians. They're all different kinds of Christians. Descartes Catholic, Kant's a Lutheran. It's like, okay, so they're informed by a Christian aesthetic. They're informed by a Christian ethics, but they can't believe in the theology, and they certainly can't share it together as something that's truly serious. That's a matter of personal opinion. So the Enlightenment's project is to build a new worldview that both replaces and does everything that the old Christendom used to do, and also validates the things that were important to them about Christendom. For example, universal human dignity. Because they're Christians now. Paganism has been extinct from Europe. Nobody's ready to go back to crucifixions and chop your hands off if you're caught stealing a loaf of bread and all the things the Romans did. We don't want to go back there. So we need a new justification for this concept of radical human dignity. And that's where the invention of human rights comes in. And that's where utilitarianism is this new philosophy there's all these attempts to take what's essentially a Christian ethics and rationalize it or justify it through whatever their new religion is. And so the Enlightenment tries to produce this new religion. And it's very ideologically motivated. And I think it's really important to emphasize how ideologically motivated it is, because the way we're taught this in school is that the scientific method is neutral, it's unbiased, it's rational. But if you read the primary sources of the guys who are putting this forward, they do not match these descriptions at all. They're occultists, like Isaac Newton. They are radically disdainful of tradition and the past, like Kant. They are like playing with really weird premises about how reality works, like Laplace, who thinks that if we can just, if you know Laplace's demon, this is this idea that if you know the position of every atom in the universe, you would be able to therefore, and you have some kind of master algorithm, like you could predict all future and all past things perfectly. Like you'd have total knowledge of the universe. So they're trying to build this like weird omniscience machine. That's basically what AI is an extension of Laplace's demon. We could talk about that later if you're interested. There's this quest for omniscience, for total power. Descartes is not just like doing geometry for fun. He says that the goal of science is for man to become the lords and possessors of nature. I mean, like these guys are very occultic. They have a very specific worldview agenda, etc. And so this becomes the new religion for modernity, secularism. And secularism, I'll just kind of come to a close here with this part by saying this. What's important to realize about secularism is that it is a religion, and what we mean by religion is a worldview. So you may know that scholars have no agreed upon definition for the word religion. There's no academic consensus about this word. And I think that's kind of silly because what we're just talking about is worldview. Everybody has a worldview. Stalinism is a worldview. Atheism is a worldview. Shintoism is a worldview. Christianity is a worldview. So secularism is a worldview. It's the worldview of the Enlightenment. It's coming out of the ashes of a destroyed Europe that no longer believes in its religion because of the Reformation. But there are reasons that caused the Reformation that are in scholasticism. We could come back to that if you want. But this religion is specifically a post-Christian religion. I think that's what's so important for people to realize about it, because all of the things that secularism believes in, they're kind of parodies of Christendom. They're parodies of ideas that only Christendom invented. They're not parodies of any pagan ideas. So the idea of human rights, and we need to radically affirm everybody's subjective situation, that comes out of this thing that we get from the Incarnation in Christianity, the radical human dignity. This idea of utopia, that we can just use technology and rationalism to create the perfect utopia on earth, whether that's a fascist utopia or a communist utopia or a liberal utopia, whatever it is, all these utopian projects, that's sort of a parody of the Christian idea of eschaton, the idea of the kingdom of heaven. We're going to make the kingdom of heaven, and it's going to look like this. You know, all of these elements, even the belief in rationalism, that's really a Christian idea, a parody of a Christian idea. Because the ancient pagans, you know, realized that nature was the domain of the gods. And if you mess with it too much, you might get smoted. And so, and also the gods rule it, and it's haunted with demons. And so if Christ defeats all the demons, then we're free to investigate nature. You know, those are those little things, those little connections that people don't realize, like how much secularism is, A, its own religion, but also B, it really is a specific kind of post-Christian religion that's drawing all of its power and its mesmerizing attraction from stuff that Christianity invented. It did not come out of whole cloth. It's really a parody of Christendom, and I think that's why it remains, its imagery and its promises remain entrancing to the Western person, because we are post-Christian. That's just what our situation is. So I hope that, I mean, that I took a lot of broad liberties there, but I hope that's...
Well, look, I think any meaningful conversation about the idea of saving the West needs to have at least a basic understanding of this bedrock of history that has brought us up to this moment, which is why I thought it was so important for you to just expand on that in the limited time that we have here. And again, encourage people to go check out your longer lectures on this, because there's so much depth there to this. And yeah, you know, we did have to skip over a large amount of history, but I think nevertheless, you've really given us the through line through history, from the pagan to the Christian to the secular, how we even got here, and the whole Reformation thing. And I want to actually ask you a brief question here without getting too much off course, because I want to bring it back to how this kind of Reformation led to a subjective worldview, which is kind of eventually led to like postmodernism, all the kind of craziness we're seeing now, and how the problems that arise when you put human beings as the arbiters of good and evil. We'll get to that in just a second, but I wanted to just very briefly ask you about how you think the Orthodox world avoided much of this that was happening in Europe, where you kind of had, I guess, maybe a rebellion against papal infallibility or supremacy of the Pope, and then nations going, no, we don't want you as the kind of head of over our state, and we're going to kind of create our own thing. And I've heard some Orthodox say, well, what the Protestants were essentially trying to do was get back to Orthodoxy that doesn't have the Pope. But I'm just wondering how Orthodoxy avoided this, where each nation, you have the sort of Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox, and they have Orthodoxy and they have their own state, but those states didn't try to, at least as far as I'm aware of, change Orthodoxy to suit their own state power and to avoid accountability to the bishops, for example, when they commit an atrocity, which you don't really get in, for example, in the case of Henry VIII, who becomes the head of the church. So, in short, how did Orthodoxy avoid all that?
I mean, history is complicated, and the divide between Byzantium and the West is really at the crux of what you're talking about. And there are many historical, geographic reasons Islam plays a role, etc., in how East and West eventually kind of go their own separate ways. So I guess the shortest way to answer the question, I think, is to flip it around a little bit and say, well, what was the West not doing or doing that ended up putting it down on this path that isn't present, that Orthodoxy isn't doing? Because the Orthodox would say, well, we didn't do anything differently. The West is what started innovating and changing things, adding feasts and doing different things. And, so much of what's going on in the West that we could talk about is that the Reformation really is not, I don't know how you would say the Reformation is trying to get back to Orthodoxy. The Reformers have no concept of Orthodoxy. The Reformers are the most Catholic people you can imagine. Like Protestants are so Catholic, like they don't realize Calvin is very scholastic. Luther is very Catholic. I mean, they are products of their Catholic culture. And there are really important elements of that Catholic culture that start to depart from the Orthodox culture. And if I had to pick one, because you could talk about additional feasts and papal supremacy and all this kind of stuff. If I had to pick one, though, I would say that it really has to do with a move away from what the Orthodox would call the immanence of the kingdom of heaven. So our liturgy is understood to be a direct, actual participation, literally, in the kingdom of heaven, in the eschaton. Now, obviously, it's in part... It's what the fathers call a foretaste. It's not the whole meal, but it really is actual participation in something that's truly present with us. Christ is truly present with us. That's where the whole iconographic tradition comes from. It's like, these people are here. They're praying with us. The angels are literally in the liturgy. I mean, that's like all over our hymnography, all this kind of stuff. And what you see in the West is sort of a weird move away from this immanence, and you can see that most obviously in the art. No icons or less icons, fewer icons. The architecture of the church has changed, the art style changes, and by the time we get to the High Middle Ages, you have all these ideas that are not immanent. God is somewhere else. He's on the other side of purgatory. The kingdom of heaven is later. You have to suffer and die first. And so there ends up being this really weird distancing of God by the time of the High Middle Ages that's expressed in all the aesthetic forms of scholasticism and even in the scholastic method kind of itself. God goes sort of somewhere else. And so I think when you put God somewhere else like that, then the world becomes this problem that you have to solve. And that problem starts to be trying to be solved by the scholastics.
Wow. Yep.
They need to model reality. They need to figure out how everything works. And then, I think there's a through line from scholasticism to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment guys are basically trying to do the same project, systematically model every part of reality so that we can understand and master it. So I think rather than say how the Orthodox avoided it, I'm more concerned about why it is that the West stopped doing the ancient things.
Yeah.
So that's a very small answer, but
yeah, no, thank you for that. It at least gives some context, and we're going to get back to Orthodoxy and maybe some of the ways it can remind us or offer us something in this really important moment where everyone's talking about the death of the West, but no one's actually offering a coherent alternative. And so we're going to get back to this later on in the conversation. So building off of the trajectory you just outlined with the whole kind of history of civilization over the last several thousand years, it seems like a major consequence of this evolution is the collapse of a shared, objective, transcendent moral framework, which kind of like a pyramid holds everything in its place in the proper order, that we have the right orientation, as you were mentioning earlier, that things may not be, perfect, certainly not, but at least we were kind of had that kind of correct orientation, in your words. Could you explain then why trying to make ourselves the arbiters of good and evil, essentially putting human beings at the top of the pyramid of deciding what's good and evil, inevitably leads to moral chaos? And how does this relate to the story of the Garden of Eden? Because it seems like it's just right there in plain text. It's just a lot of people don't read Genesis anymore. We don't have that cultural reference. And so could you explain that to us? Like what goes wrong when human beings become the arbiters of good and evil?
Well, you have to take a big step back and ask yourself, like, well, what are you talking about when you say the good? What do you mean by the good? What is morality even? And this is a longer thing, obviously, but one thing that's obvious to note about morality is that morality has to be something that's outside of and higher than the self. And the good has to be something that just is good. Not because anyone said so. Not because it's anyone's preference. Like, definitionally, that's what we mean by the good. So this is the thought experiment I do with students sometimes. I say, okay, well, why don't we just exterminate this entire people group? And then after everybody picks their jaws up from the floor, I say, why not? And they're like, well, it's wrong. And I say, says who? I think it's right. And well, and then, there's all these, and all I do the whole time is I keep saying, why not?
Yeah.
Why not? How come? Why not? And at some point very soon we get to the, well, they don't want to be exterminated. And I say, I don't care what they want. I want to exterminate them. And they say, well, would you want to be exterminated? And I go, of course not. But that's just my preference. You still haven't told me why is it wrong. And at a certain point, actually, usually we get somebody to say, well, and they just all flustered about it, like, it's just wrong. And I say, good, you're right. It is just wrong. But what do we mean by that? Yep. You certainly don't mean it's arbitrary. And you certainly don't mean it's a matter of opinion. And you certainly don't mean there's no reason for it. It's just wrong. What you're saying is, that's the nature of reality, that things are this way. In other words, it's kind of like stating a moral fact. It's like asking the question, why is a fish and not a horse? It's a weird question, because a fish is a fish. It's not a horse. Like, it's a weird, meaningless question. And so the question is, well, why is it the good? It's in a similar situation. What we mean by morality is something that is just a moral fact. It's something that's true about the moral nature of reality. It's like saying there are things that exist. There's not a reason for it. That's just, well, God made stuff, but it's like, you see what I mean? Yeah. Like, there are just facts about reality. And so when you dig around and you try to really scrutinize these moral statements, you get to the point where you have to say, it's just wrong because it is wrong. Or you have to say, this is the good, because that's what the good is. Otherwise, where does it stop? Yep. It just becomes arbitrary. You just go in circles forever. And so when you realize that that's the nature of morality, and obviously we could say a lot more about that, but one basic takeaway is, therefore, it is something that's independent of anyone's opinions, has nothing really to do with anybody's preferences, and it's outside of and independent of me and you and any person. And so whenever you define the good as dependent on the self in its preferences and its opinions, you haven't arrived at the good yet. And so to make man the center means you actually definitionally destroy what morality means, what we all mean by morality. It must be outside of and independent of the self. So what's going on with Genesis? Well, the way, because you say, okay, well, if you give me a second, if you say, okay, so you're just talking about God's opinion, So it's just God's opinion. And that's how a lot of Protestants talk about it. Well, it's God wills, it's God's will. It's like, no, if it can't just be God says so, therefore it is. Because obviously, if you know the Euthyphro dilemma, he could have said, tomorrow he can say, well, rape and murder are morally great, so go for it. And then it would have to be so. And obviously that doesn't jive with us because that's not what we mean by the good either. And then you might say, okay, well, so the good is something outside of an independent, even of God. And that's wrong too, because then now we're not really talking about he who is reality it is. The Christian answer to this dilemma is God and goodness are the same thing. God is goodness itself. You say, oh, God is so good. That just means like God let me buy a house or something. God did something materially that I appreciated. When we say God is good, we mean a real equal sign there. He is goodness itself, just like he is reality itself. I talk about this in my book. So if God is goodness itself, then now we can answer the Genesis question that you asked. Note carefully what the serpent says to Eve. He tells her, she says, if we eat of this fruit, we'll surely die. And he says, no. But then he says, you shall be as gods. Knowing good and evil, right from wrong, whatever. So in other words, he's telling Eve, you can be your own source of being. God has told you that he is goodness itself, but you can actually be the center. You can be goodness itself and reality itself and life itself. Now, obviously, a human being, by definition, can't be any of those things. That's why the fall sort of occurs. I'm giving one reading of Genesis. There are many that can all be true, but this is just one dimension to it. But, so therefore, when morality is reduced to preference, you really aren't talking about the good anymore. So obviously, it breaks down, and that's what leads to all of these. Like every single political, ethical conversation in modernity is like, how do we reconcile the individual to the community or to other individuals? Because I want the last cookie and you want the last cookie. Like that's all of modernity's moral political problem in a nutshell. What do we do? And this is baffling to us because we've separated everyone into their own little gods.
Whew. Okay, so one of the things that I also butt up against on this, just to expand on it a little bit more, is that when I have these conversations and they say, well, things are just bad, and I say, well, why? And first of all, people think that I'm justifying, murder and rape and all those things. I'm saying, no, but why? Where are you getting this idea from? Where is it grounded in? And they say, one of the answers I hear a lot is that, well, society has agreed on those things, that we've got a group consensus, that we all got together and we decided, well, murder's really bad, so we're not going to do that anymore. I say, yeah, but the moment you have another group over there who have a different consensus and they actually agree that gassing the Jews in the gas chambers is actually a good thing, you have no leg to stand on to point to them and say, well, the Nazis were bad because, hey, we're all just running off of group consensuses, like our own little individual bubbles here and there. And when I talk to people about ethics, and it seems like everyone's obsessed with ethics, it doesn't matter what it is, social justice, racism, sexism, animal rights, it doesn't matter. I say, you don't realize that you are absolutely teetering on the edge of a major metaphysical dilemma if you remain in a space where there's no God, because it just automatically crashes back in on your opinion versus my opinion. Automatically it's subjective. Automatically you've just destroyed your own activism, So it's a really strange thing, and I always see the connection to the Garden of Eden, and this idea that this is the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which is kind of like a way of saying good and bad, morality and that kind of thing. At least that's one interpretation. And so there's this kind of desire to take it upon yourself, to have it for you, and as the snake says, you to become as gods. And so I think, at least from what I've just said and what you've just said, for people that might have already, who have not thought about this very much, can at least maybe start to see that there is at least a utilitarian benefit to having God fulfill that role, to have a God in that place. But a lot of the time people might say, well, I just don't believe in God. Like, I believe in science. I believe in the empirical. I believe in what I can see. I believe in all those kinds of things. How have you approached this kind of conversation to narrow the gap between what you describe as a kind of sacramental way of seeing the world, a participatory relationship with God, versus someone who's deeply in the secular and is just completely not seeing anything you're talking about? How do you close that gap between someone who says, well, I just believe in science?
Well, the Mostly, I mean, I just point out that they don't just believe in science.
Okay.
Because the scientific method is an empiricism and rationalism. I mean, you can actually prove precious little of any importance on pure empiricism. Like, philosophers have pointed this out a lot. I was very appreciative of William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga, who were analytic philosophers popular about 10 years ago. And they pointed out all of these things where it's like, on pure, strict, rationalist, materialist, empiricism, whatever, meaning you just believe that there's only matter and physical stuff and there's no such thing as the spiritual, you can't demonstrate almost anything of importance. You can't believe in any kind. You're forced to dismiss all religious experience of all people at all times as illusory. So that from a scientific perspective, that's like taking 90% of the data of the human experience and just throwing it in the trash. So whenever we're throwing out 90% of the data from a data set, that just doesn't seem scientific to me. Like, you have to account for religion for like, why does every culture, every society, at every point in history except our tiny little niche culture at this time, and it's not even all cultures in the present world. Go to South America and they all believe in crazy enchanted world. It's like, how can you really justify throwing out 90% of the human experience? Something is very off with that can't merely be dismissed that way. The second thing is, you can't actually prove really basic postulates about reality on this view. For example, can you prove that other minds exist? Like, meaning, I have this experience of consciousness, but I don't experience anyone else's consciousnesses directly. I assume that you have a conscience because you're showing all the visible signs that you have a consciousness. And I'm assuming that other minds exist, meaning I assume other people are conscious beings and they have their own individual experience of consciousness, but I can't really prove that. Like, we can hook up stuff to the brain and measure brain waves, but that's actually not the same thing. And so something else that follows from this is, like, why should minds exist at all on a purely physical view of the world? And you say, well, it's something that emerges out of the brain as an organ, blah, blah. There's so many problems with that theory, right? So a simple test is, do you get sad or does your brain get sad? Your brain experiences, we can measure like what we might call sadness with various brain imaging things. But your brain doesn't get sad, you get sad. That's something off there. That doesn't explain anything. The other thing is causation itself. So David Hume, philosopher, he had this thought experiment about billiard balls, meaning like he played pool a lot, I guess. And he said, if one billiard ball strikes another and the second one moves as a result, we don't really know that the second one moved because the first one hit it. We don't really know that. We assume that because we see the effect. And we can reasonably assume and rationally kind of take this to be the case, but we don't actually know how to prove causation. And there's a lot more to talk about with Hume, and people have different arguments about this, but like, that was something that very early on in the Enlightenment, in other words, they realized that they couldn't actually prove the necessary mechanism for science with the scientific method. Another thing is reason and math. Science assumes rational givens. It doesn't demonstrate them. Everything has to have an assumption that it starts with and then it builds towards. Science doesn't prove any of the logical and mathematical truths that it assumes. So it assumes them and then it does its experimentation. So it's like, this is a little technical maybe, and there's a lot more you could say, but the problem with the scientific method is, as your only, so I love science. Science is cool. But like, if that's your only truth-getting mechanism, suddenly minds are off the table, Science itself is off the table. Rationalism, logic and reason is off the table. Causation is really a question mark. Religious experience has to go in the trash. And here's the most important one. You can't really believe in morality on a purely scientific method. This is what I kind of twist on people a little bit. I say, okay, great. Let's just assume only physical exists. You just lost the right to say that's wrong.
Right.
You can say, I don't like that. You can say, that disgusts me. You can say, that is not a good way to achieve XYZ goal. Such as if our goal is to have a utopian paradise where everyone is maximally happy, randomly killing people does not achieve that goal. But you can't say it's wrong, because when you say something's wrong, you're saying that there's a moral nature to reality, like we talked about. Mm-hmm. So to me, this is the most important. Like, all those other ones are true.
Yeah.
And they're technically true, but they're a little difficult sometimes for people to wrap their heads around. Mm. The simple one is, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in anything at all. And I'm against religion because it does moral abominations. Oh, really? Really now?
Yeah.
Nobody is really a physicalist / materialist.
Yeah.
I've met exactly one atheist in my life. He really didn't believe in any morality at all.
Right. Right. And, this is what's interesting about someone like Sam Harris, who I might agree with on all kinds of other sort of more political observations that he makes. But when it comes to the foundation of his worldview, of atheism, and his work to, I think he called it the moral landscape, I think it is, that we can scientifically determine, like a mountain range, things that are good and things that are bad on case-by-case basis. It's like, sure, you could spend $1 trillion working out every minutia of human interaction and what's good and what's bad, and create your own sort of 10 commandments, which would be like a list, like 1 billion notes long. But you don't have a why. Like, why are you doing this? Like, what for? Like, there's no authority that you've got to determine that you are right or correct or incorrect about this. And it's not grounded in any sort of sense of objectivity because, again, there's no kind of God in the picture. That there is no why driving it. So I don't know if you've noticed that, if you want to maybe expand on that in some of the new atheist thought, because it seems to me like there's this sort of huge, gigantic elephant in the room when atheists are discussing ethics and morality. And whenever I've discussed this with an atheist, they really don't like it. They almost think that the argument, that it sounds intelligent, but they say that there's nothing actually there. And I'm like, no, like, this is your cognitive dissonance. Like, you're not seeing this. Like, this is me proving to you that you've built it on sand and there's nothing there and you don't have a leg to stand on. So I'd love for you to maybe expand on some of this if you'd like to.
Yeah, I read The God Delusion twice, and I was just so blown away by how ignorant it was. I mean, just from a very... the new atheists were hitting their popularity stride, kind of breaking out when I was at the end of high school and early college. And so we had a lot of conversations about this stuff. And I was just consistently baffled by their total inability to even be a part of the same conversation as people, as Christians or historians or anything. I mean, Richard Dawkins' argument against the existence of God, I think it's chapter 7 of The God Delusion. He says that God, it's so incoherently presented too. I was spoiled by a lot of analytic philosophers, like I said, but it basically boils down to something like, to be omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent are such high degrees of power or superlativeness or whatever as to require a being of incredible complexity. And the chances that that being could have ever evolved are so minuscule that we can safely conclude that no such being has ever evolved. And this argument was, I forget who said this, but there was an atheist philosopher, I think he was at Yale, who said that this argument was the worst argument ever offered for or against any proposition in the history of philosophy. And it's atheist, by the way. And he wasn't being like doing this for the social media slam dunk or whatever. He was right, technically speaking. And the reason he gave is that every single term in the argument was misunderstood or wrong. the definition for God, the definition for property, the definition, like you're just working with total incoherence. And I'm not super familiar with the work of Sam Harris. I watched a few of his debates with William Lane Craig and back in the day, but that's what I saw also. I saw a lot of incoherence in terms of just philosophical consistency about what it is we're even talking about, because you can't, especially on morality. Like, what are we talking about when we're talking about morality? And it remains true that either you're talking about something that's dependent on a civilization, it's contingent, like this civilization agreed that this is moral, this individual agreed that this is moral, this thing is moral because we said so, and that can change, like you pointed out, which is also really ironic. Like, why is it that the West gets to have concentration camps and nuke Japan and then string up the Axis powers and put them on trial for crimes against humanity as though they did not also commit crimes against humanity? Like, it just doesn't, none of that makes any sense. Not that I'm justifying anybody, I'm justifying nobody, actually. I have to say this for the record, right? But, you know, and Sam Harris, the same thing is kind of my point. It's like, if either it's something we said so, or it's a moral fact about reality. And the moral nature of reality requires something non-physical. It requires uncaused cause. It requires morality as an absolute category. It doesn't have to be God in a Christian sense. It can be pagan. You know, Cicero's talking about the law. He's talking about the moral law. And he said the moral law cannot be changed by the dictates of the Senate or the will of the people. Right. And there's not a different moral law in Rome and in Greece. Like, there is just the moral law.
Yep. So
that's Cicero. He doesn't know what Christianity is at all.
Yep.
You know, but these new atheists, they are Christians. This is my ultimate poke back. They are Christians because, meaning they're post-Christian. They've been formed by Enlightenment values, and the Enlightenment's conceit is that it can recreate all the positive effects of Christendom, the radical human dignity, the rationalism, the attempted utopia, or the eschaton, really, in a secular form, without God. That's the whole experiment. We can make Christendom without God. We don't need God. That rhetoric is all over these guys. And the new atheists are just sort of the last gasp of this old materialism. But people aren't materialists anymore. I think that age is passing away.
Yeah, I think so too.
You know, people believe in weird stuff that has no business being believed on materialism.
Yeah. And the other thing that is, you know, since we're pointing out some of these kind of contradictions or the cognitive dissonance within the sort of new atheist mindset, is that they will simultaneously say that, well, religion was just an invention of human beings because it served our survival as a group. It instilled things such as, you know, looking after the weak or charity or to love your neighbor and all that kind of stuff. But that's just a creation. It's a product of Darwinism, and it's just helping the survival of the group. And these are from atheists who believe in Darwinism and believe that basically the whole point of human existence is survival and the passing down of your genes. And I think, well, okay, if I just entertain your thoughts that that's all it is, why aren't you religious? Because if it serves the benefit of humankind and it's Darwinian and it helps our survival, and you're saying that you are those things, why aren't you religious again? Oh, no, I just think it's all ridiculous. Okay, and so what we've seen now, after, you know, decades of the new atheist type movement and people like Richard Dawkins pushing this, is that he's finally seen that a country like the United Kingdom actually can't survive anymore. Like, it has no coherent sense of values or identity or anything else after he's helped to degrade it over his entire career. And now at the 11th hour has jumped in and said, oh, actually, I think I'm a cultural Christian. You know, they're like, well okay, so so you get to eat, you know, take your cake and eat it too, kind of thing. Do you think that's what's going on?
I mean, I don't follow them very much because I got tired of a total inability to define terms in any real way. But you know, the funny part about all of this is that part of, like, this is back to the historical conversation. Okay, well, what is the new atheism? Because again, you could just not believe in stuff. I mean, it seems that perhaps some of the Roman senators may have not really totally believed in some of the things that happened in the Roman religion, but they still all went along with it because they're Romans. You know, there's no problem. So what's very, the telltale about the New Atheist movement is its animosity. It has this really very obvious, undeniable disdain and its chip on its shoulder toward religion. And I'll give a little credit where it's due, I think, which is Sam Harris's book. My understanding, I think he said, was that he started writing God is Not Great right after 9/11. And obviously God is Not Great is not a poke at Christianity, it's a poke at Islam. And so the realization that maybe Islam has something we should be concerned about in it, that's a good question to ask. And that seems like it was the start of this movement, and that's a question worth exploring. How concerned should we be about this particular movement, people group, whatever? But it got overshadowed because of their inability to distinguish between Islam and literally any other religion. So then it drew the wrath of these Christian defenders who very definitively, I mean, if you don't know this, I mean, Alvin Plantinga, analytic philosopher, William Lane Craig is a famous Christian debater. I mean, they definitively, and David Bentley Hart, I think those three definitively put the New Atheist movement into the ground. I mean, they kept talking, obviously, but all of the critiques, all of the concerns, all of the arguments were completely buried either in live debate or through print. There was no rebuttal. It was a complete single-sided massacre from a philosophical academic perspective, and so then it went away. But why did it happen in the first place? And my point in bringing up the fact that the telltale of the New Atheist movement is disdain. Partly that's because they're concerned about Islam, but partly it's because that's the product of the Enlightenment. That's endemic to the Enlightenment, is that religion is primitive, it's superstitious, it's foolish, religion is bad. Like that is a part of the Enlightenment's DNA, and these guys are just kind of the last sort of products of that traditional Enlightenment stance. Now, why are they mad about this? Because of the 30 Years' War, because of the abuses. That was real. That was real. But the idea that therefore religion is broken, that's really a cultural reaction to the 30 Years' War and that whole period. No, it's not a matter of the evidence of all of history.
And do you think this is also part of the problem with the lack of definition around a religion, where the kind of secular world and the Enlightenment used to say, well, religions are bad, we don't have a religion anymore, we have this kind of neutral truth understanding of reality, when in actual fact, if we're just talking about different worldviews, a little bit like software on a computer, and every computer needs a software, and you can't really exist without a worldview or some kind of ideology that's guiding you, helping you make sense of reality and detecting patterns, and just, so you can actually live your life. That actually secularity and secularism is a religion, and not only is it a religion, but it is an extremely forceful religion that asserts itself with so much confidence that this is actually the way to see reality, that this is neutral, this is the truth. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the neutrality thing is really an important sort of logical trick that got played after the Enlightenment, and it's sort of an equivocation. So the new Enlightenment, whatever thing, is going to be neutral with respect to the established religions of the culture at the time, Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, whatever. That's true. But that doesn't mean you can therefore have a neutral worldview in its entirety. That doesn't actually make sense. So the critics of the Enlightenment, who would come much later, ended up calling this the view from nowhere. Because where is this magical view from nowhere where you take no sides about things like that? If you think about that for a little bit logically, it kind of doesn't make sense. And so everything is a worldview. That's why I define things, and I say, okay, whatever you mean by religion, let's just put that down for a second, and let's just talk about worldviews. Everyone has a worldview. Everything is a worldview. You can't have a view of the world without it being a worldview. That's just definitional. And when we start using that language, the conversation gets a lot more coherent. because then suddenly secularism is very much its own worldview. That's very clear. But its neutral language kind of gets smuggled in all of the time. But that doesn't mean anything, because it can't mean it's not a worldview. All it can mean is it's the right worldview. You see the sleight of hand there? This is the neutral starting point. We can only the physical world is provable, so we're all going to agree on that as the default. And anything else you want to add to that is extra. That sounds neutral, but that's what we call question begging in philosophy. Meaning you assume your conclusion is one of your premises. The physical world is what it is. We're all going to agree on that, right? That, and anything you want to add is extra. Okay, that itself is a assumption that we didn't prove.
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. I wanted to pivot slightly to a little brief question before I move on to the issue of how do we save the West? And that is, and I'm not really sure how to ask the question. I haven't really passed it through properly, but I don't know whether it's a chicken and an egg kind of situation, but what is the role of identity in determining ethics and morality? Like, is this something you've given much thought to? Because it seems that we were talking earlier, the reason, like the big why for ethics, for why mass murder is wrong and why rape, the reason why is because it goes back to our identity. If we're made in the image of God, then downstream from that, you get human rights, you get the dignity of the human being, you get, murder being wrong. But if our identity is that we are just blobs of meat that is part of a cosmic accident that has just occurred on this rock or floating around this star by accident, and that's our identity, you can't get human rights from that. You don't get radical dignity. You don't get any of that stuff. And I was wondering whether identity is really important in this whole discussion, and whether you feel like some of the craziness that's happening in Western society right now around what seems to be this huge identity crisis, not only about gender and sexuality, but also like the race wars and intersectionality, splitting up identity groups to try and determine a kind of moral order in the universe. And all of these questions, what is a woman? What is a man? That this is part of the psychosis that has happened as a result of us, cutting ourselves off from God, essentially.